This the name is protagonist. You can. Put someone in the chat if you're able to hear me. Excellent. It seems like we've got some folks here already. Connection is caught up. Excellent. Glad you guys could join today. We'll get started in a couple seconds here. Let a few more people trickle in, but we'll do a few early acknowledgments. Winston Tokuhisa first here. Glad you can make it. Os. F Holiday. Os. Glad you can make it again. Toya the Texan. Os. All Star G. Os. Glad you can make it. KP from KC5. Os. Shango Zulu. Os. 7Q Pit. Os. I just saw your email a second ago. So I'm definitely going to take a look at the resources you provided. It sounds interesting. And I've been actually wanting to talk about the Tokugawa era for some time now. And who knows, maybe I'll bring up the Edo period today. We'll see. We'll see. Got a lot I want to go over today. We're going to take our time with this one. Aquateki. Glad you can make it, family. Os. Also, if you guys haven't subscribed to his channel, man, definitely go take a look at that. He's got some good info on IG. Got Cynical Optimist, Heiwa, and Os. Glad you can make it, man. I've been making my rounds all throughout the space, so definitely good to see some familiar faces. Let's see. Got Indigo Flows here. Os. Glad you can make it as well. Let's see. Haru in Apocalypse. Os. Glad to see you, fam. Oh, maybe I am talking about Kipateki. My fault, family. We got Deshaun. I guess technically that's Os. Os. Appreciate you, fam. Let's see, we got a couple people in here. So we'll go ahead and get started. Firstly, to the founders of the space, Os. To those of you who have made it to the dojo, Os. This is the nameless protagonist. Thank you for joining me today. As you can see by the title, we will be revisiting the verbal sword form, Form 2, specifically talking about environmental mastery. And what made Sword Form 2 interesting is it helped us apply an understanding to the way human beings relate to culture and its shadow, civilization, and how the two interplay on each other and from their superposition manifest the environment. What's important about this point is that Within this environmental expression between civilization and culture, you have a natural expression of the environment, what you could call the geography or the ecosystem. Well, ecosystem can apply broadly, but in the context that I'm speaking of, if you take a look outside and you understand the way of the natural world, if there were no technology, at least as we see it today, and it was left relatively undisturbed, you would have the meaning of what is described as the natural environment. The next expression of this environment is understood, or as I describe it, as the physical environment. A good word for this could be identified as infrastructure. This infrastructure is important because, once again, and I'll remind you, there is a cultural modality and a civilizational modality. And it's from the superposition of these two things. If in your mind you can envision two circles coming together to form a Venn diagram, the space at which these two circles overlap, serves as the superposition I'm describing. So natural, the geology of the world, the physical, the infrastructure that forms as a result, and lastly, the social environment, what we might call society. When you have a bit of a framework to have conversations, a lens by which to examine human behavior, it becomes a useful tool to take a look at some of the institutions that help maintain and balance these things. It also becomes very apparent that whenever there is a change in either one of those spheres, that it would inevitably affect the ecosystem or the homeostasis that has been established within the environment that we just described, be it on the physical, be it on the natural, or be it on the social. The axiom that I want to hyper focus on today, which ironically places it in alignment with a video BGS did, I believe it was yesterday, speaking about culture. The axiom I want to put forward, and I'll type it in here. Maybe I'll post the comment as well so it can serve as a theme. A culture in motion stays in motion until a greater culture acts upon it. I really want to take a little time to marinate on that statement, because ultimately there is a concept that springs from that: cultural inertia. Cultural inertia plays such an important role. But the problem is, when you experience your life subjectively and you only relate it with regards to an individual perspective, the pathway of a single individual who is part of an aggregate can be so random, since it doesn't experience the phenomenon of being caught in the wake of something per se. It is easy to do what I call anecdotal collapse, of having a conversation of a trajectory of a group of people, but then isolate it to the individual particle that behaves completely different. In particularly, different based off the expectations you already have for it with regards towards that. There's an assumption that if everyone does this, then it should affect the trajectory of the aggregate, which sounds great on paper, but it's much more like trying to herd cats by forcing everybody to adhere to a specific ideology, unless you've some external force or external means by which to make that happen. But something interesting occurs when you measure these things over time, when you observe these things over time, patterns emerge. It's kind of like what was experienced with particle wave theory. During particle wave theory, matter behaved differently when it was observed versus when it was not observed. They did what was called the dual slit experiment, and they just simply shot particles through a slit. When left to its own devices, the random means by which these particles were shot created an interference pattern along the wall, which looked like kind of a band, a spectrum. It implied a wave-like frequency, kind of like energy. However, when they tried to directly observe this process happening to see what was going on, suddenly these particles started acting as you would expect, and the wave pattern disappeared, and it just formed solid straight lines. Over and over and over again, this is completed and demonstrated. Aquateki says, like light itself, precisely. They use photons for that experiment, so people, in case you want to go back and take a look at that experiment yourself. What's so interesting about this is it seems to be touching on a universal principle that even human beings are not divorced from. Just like an individual person could demonstrate an array of potential behaviors and choices, when you take a step back and remove that individual and look at the group from which he belongs, patterns, very clear patterns, begin to emerge. And the system ultimately becomes shown for what it is. I think this is one of the most profoundly interesting things about our world and observable reality. And what makes it more interesting is to see the field of social science attempt to tackle this. But it demonstrates itself in so many various ways. Something I want to draw a bit of attention to is the role that culture plays in this equation when we're addressing this particular verbal martial art form and addressing the environment. We're going to touch on civilization next, but I want to focus on culture and specifically the means by which culture is realized. What role culture plays with regards to humanity, and how culture has the potential and ability to affect the wave-like behavior of a people's, irregardless of what the particle aspect of the person is looking for. I'm gonna pause for a second and make a couple more acknowledgements since a few more people made their way in here. We got Ian Graves that showed up. Let's see, where you at, fam? There you are. Os. Glad you can make it. An American Negro. Os. Let me pull up this right here and we will get started. I think this is it. All right. So I'm going to make a bit of a presumptuous statement. No, I'm going to save that to the end. I'm going to save that to the end. I think it will become less presumptuous once I present some of this information here first. And we'll move to that point with that in mind. I want to start by saying human beings as a whole, unlike other entities and creatures that have a large base of subconscious information that they're born with, there is a requirement due to the complex neurology of the human brain for it to, one, have a longer gestation period, and number two, be subject to a process of child development and even post-child development that's required for the individual to properly function within society. I think this is a critical point to make because this contextualizes what role culture plays in its serving as a kind of liaison or interface of the human being to the natural world around it. I think that this is what separates human beings from the animal kingdom directly, or at least provides a kind of segue artificially, where if you use sci-fi terms, your culture is kind of like a force field. Within that force field, there are certain things that are allowed to exit, and there's certain things that are allowed to enter. Irrespective of it, the intention of the culture is to serve as a means by which you are protected. But oftentimes, that culture ends up being a means by which individuals are slave to. We can get into why that occurs, but I think it's important to keep that in mind to recognize the value of culture. It is a way to insulate yourself from the natural world, insofar as every human being on Earth doesn't get to where they are without some modality of culture surrounding them. Now, the question does become whether or not that culture that they may have had genetic congruency with is compatible with them. But there's some interesting processes that happen during rearing that are very important. Two in particular catch my attention. There is the biological aspect that comes along with that. And then there's the developmental aspect that occurs of growing up in the culture itself as it relates to the individual and their development. If we take a look at personality, if one considers that personality can emerge from a range of potentiality, that core from which personality emerges is the human potential. Some people call it human nature. Some people even go so far as to give it spiritual names, the nature of God, the divine spark. It was talked about by a lot of philosophical perspectives that drive where it comes from. I think for the context of this conversation, I'll just stick with human nature, because evolutionary psychology will talk in great length to examine human nature. It strips away culture, it strips away any kind of modifying principle to the human being and asks a very strict, specific, objective question. What is it to be human? Within those potentialities and even the verbiage that are being used right now to speak on subjects like transhumanism, to discern at what point does technology overtake the general dignity of what is defined as human nature. Human nature is acknowledged as a thing from which what we call human emerges. It is essentially the blank slate, the blank piece of paper from which whatever can be written upon. And I think it's important because ultimately what we're saying is human beings and the way that they end up with regards to personality in relation to the culture is highly impersonable or impressionable. What occurs with the environment is a means by which what already exists can be brought forward. And so if we understand that this is the basis under which human beings engage with reality in the world around them via the culture, no human experience exists in a vacuum. There's no such thing as something not being subjective or an objective rearing of an individual. I think we can mostly agree that the potential for human beings is profound. The question becomes, how much of that potential is drawn out and what aspects of that potential is being demanded by both the environment around them in the immediate sense, in the natural sense, in the physical sense, and in the social sense. It's in this way child development becomes so profound in setting the tone and the context under which a person is likely to head. Back to this term, cultural inertia. A culture in motion stays in motion until a greater culture acts upon it. At first, it was thought that this process begins the moment someone is born. They're bombarded by a completely different environment outside of the placenta. They get an overwhelming shock to their system by various means, and they're forced to adopt. They develop their pattern of engagement via crying and other methods that are somewhat intrinsic to human beings. And the pattern of getting your needs met starts with this exchange with the parents, beginning with the mother. But it's very likely that this pattern is actually much more nuanced and begins far sooner than being born. If we understand that from a genetic sense, there is your actual genetic code, there is also, in the spirit of adaptability, a means by which that genetic code is expressed. The science of researching this phenomenon and potentiality is known as epi-genetics. And it serves such a profound role with regards to the way your genes are expressed that it can influence things down to your genetic predispositions. Meaning, you take your cue from the environment and you respond to it epigenetically by having the potential of your genes being flipped and switched on and off in anticipation of the environment you are expected to enter in. I think this is groundbreaking with regards to understanding how human beings form and develop. We know that women play a profound role in this process by virtue of their contribution to the process as being gateways through which humanity is realized. Emphasis on this word, gateway or portal. Portals are ways by which two planes are united through a joint pathway shared between them for the purposes of something to traverse from one plane to the next. Much like a ship comes into harbor, so too do human beings develop and then leave the womb. This is the etymological. That is the root word origin of this word born or birth. Etymology is the word I was looking for. If there is a minimum of a 9-month process where that genetic amalgamation that is human, which is in the process of being transferred from the unseen world to the seen world, then there's an opportunity for this genetic bundling to become influenced epigenetically through the mother. When we note the nature of what the placenta actually is, it serves as nothing more than a blood barrier. It means that all of that stress, all of that trauma, all of that hormonal exchange is being affected by the life that's being developed within that portal. What's important to understand is that there are unconscious cues being taken. If it's a stressful environment, if the mother is not eating, if the food that the mother is eating is very sporadic and not related to the actual demands that her body's making, if there is high stress, if there are negative tendencies, so too does the life that is being cultivated there inherit this modality. And so mechanisms of defense and preparation are being prepared subconsciously, long before there's a conscious thought that we can even measure, long before the complex neural network is even put in place. The cells and the mechanisms that kick this process to work are busy changing the actors that are going to play the performance known as that particular human being. In shifting the actors, the script doesn't need to be changed. But what will change is the way by which that script is executed. And certain things that may not have been expressed soon become apparent. But that can become problematic, because what if the environment the mother finds themselves in, or the environment that is being insinuated by the life that is in the process of being made realized, is preparing for an environment that no longer exists? There's a period of scarcity that happens, a period of abuse that occurs in the early development when it's profoundly important. In the instances that occur very often, where the mother is 2-3 months pregnant and doesn't even know. And so in that critical 45-day mark, when that fetal development is taking place and that child is becoming made realized, at least on a genetic level, fully subject to the environment the mother is creating, it was met with alcohol, smoke, whether it be first or secondhand, possibly illegal substances, profound mood swings and stress, unhealthy foods being consumed, things biochemically imbalanced or overprocessed, dehydration, emotional trauma. That is the environment that this child is being prepared for. Something that the father, having already contributed his act as summoner to provide the seed by which that will be brought forth from, plays no role. At most, whatever that seed experienced at the duration that the father and the seed were attached and associated, the father's epigenetic contribution ended there at the point of conception. All else is being passed on from the mother. This isn't an attack or slight on women. This is just simple biological, factual realization that the mother is literally priming that child for the environment under which that child is expected to become summoned from. And we know now that it almost turns into a chicken or the egg sort of scenario when we look at what started first. But irrespective of how it started, in the time period under which this child is becoming cultivated, they're already being influenced by the environment or the perceived environment. And so now this child is born. Having had 9 months of epigenetic influence from the mother, it then begins an additional point of orientation. Year zero. And even with that, there are many things that are taking place on day one. For example, the formation of this child's gut microbiome. Some of this is started while in the womb. But once they enter the unseen to the seen world, a few things take place. The first of which being getting your first exposure to the gut biome from the birth canal. And what a lot of people don't know is that during this last month, the birth canal, its bacterial and pH change. The same bacteria that is found in your stomach is found there. The purpose of that is to set the basis under which the gut biome within the child begins upon exit. There are also several chemicals that are released that help form a bond between the child and the mother. It's a kind of imprinting process that takes place. But in the developed West, upwards of almost 80% of births now are done through cesarean section, skipping this process almost entirely, which hinders a few things. One, this now disrupts the gut biome within the child. Number two, that hormone is not released in the same capacity, dampening, hindering the potentiality for that bond. Even though it's biochemical, this idea of why this process even happens in the first place is lost, which hurts the context under which most human beings, at least prior to this modern first world era, was experienced under. Now, it's not to condemn the action of this happening with people who have serious complications. Let's say if they didn't do that because of overdevelopment of the child, or possibly the child being in danger, if they didn't interfere, this is different. But as a standard procedure, the overwhelming majority of children being born now in the modern first world share a common denominator in that now many of them are going without that initial bonding process, that initial stage set to prepare them for the environment under which they're expected to enter into. Second, back to the gut biome once again. When a woman is in the process of lactating, immunocells serve as transports for a lot of the gut bacteria that are in the stomach. They travel outside through the intestinal lining, and it's from there it makes it into the bloodstream and helps produce that breast milk that is passed on to the child. That is another way that the child begins to develop their gut biome. So much so that this is what helps ease the process by which a child goes from non-solid foods to solid foods. And all it takes is a little bit of a study on how your gut biome has a profound impact on not only the way you break down and digest your food. They've been able to actually cure things such as psychological disorders, reverse aging, address the issue of obesity, all through manipulating, addressing, and providing nutritional intervention to the gut biome. How much more so would people then be subject to chronic issues if that gut biome is being imbalanced and offset from the very onset? Because things such as artificial formulas or things other than what human beings have historically received is being offered to these children. Each of these things is serving as an imbalancing effect. And knowing that this, in and of itself, runs the potential of affecting your ability to adjust and adapt. It's no wonder we begin to see certain expressions epigenetically become shut off and other things that aren't favorable turned on, such as things that would leave you prone to storing fat, such as things that would leave you insulin resistant. I think just a casual glance at our statistics when it pertains to a lot of these long-term non-communicatable diseases, we overrepresent in that category relative to our population. Disproportionately, these things are seen in women, meaning there's a greater possibility and probability that these things get passed on to the children. And this isn't even getting into the psychological issues with regards to that. However, this is where we defer back again to the development of human nature, this potential. So already, this has been preparing these children for an environment of scarcity. And even if you're living a middle-class lifestyle with the ability to even stay home for childcare, all of this stress is already placed on the child. Genetically speaking, they're being prepared for some kind of war zone, some sort of prison. How much more so then that these aspects of human nature get hyper-focused and then drawn forth in preparation, as all things do. And how much more so then that the culture that helps develop the personality shares a similar history of having been in an environment like that for an extended period of time. What is the likelihood then that the personality that manifests and emerges from the infinite potential seemingly of human nature, that these personalities reflect originating from some place of scarcity? I think while it's possible to have something different emerge, the probability is that the inertia that is putting you in a particular direction, you're more than likely to repeat. So in aggregate, there's certain aspects of human nature that become overemphasized to prepare for an environment that may not even exist anymore. And this is how you get a change in the aggregate that appears to be absolutely and utterly invisible from the individual perspective. I think it's respectable to give that a little bit of pause, because it's in this critical period where the personality is being cultivated that the human brain is the most impressionable. From the ages of 0 to 7, you are essentially a ball of instincts, utterly dependent on the parents and the environment around you. Your culture, essentially then, which is wielded by the parents and imposed upon by the environment, is the incubator under which you manifest. And every tool that you require becomes shaped in this period, much like an iron that is hot is molded into the shape that it was intended for. As time goes on, the iron cools, and with the cooling of that iron, the final form takes shape, solidifies, and becomes locked. This is why the purpose understanding, the purpose modality of existence of human beings becomes absolutely paramount. Without purpose, if you are just a lump of iron being shaped to somebody's convenient expression, you may be shaped into something that isn't even befitting your personality or nature. The culture may be preparing you and shaping you into something that it's already moved beyond and doesn't even need anymore. And if you haven't been offered the tools, the preparation to take on these roles, to take on these tasks, how can you expect to compete and perform that role with others who've been primed for it from the very onset? For some places and some people, down to the very names they were given. I think that's something that, in the name of progress, and I'm digressing here, where civilization introducing the era of the industrial complex corporatized the family model, emphasized what would be best for corporations, and superimposed that upon the culture of all peoples. I would make the argument that those in the Edo social complex experienced that before probably anybody else, in the form of Thomas Jefferson's slave breeding program, starting in 1804, all the way up through 1865. It's for that purpose that I make the argument that what is called Black, specifically in America, is nothing more than a corporate entity from which those that are classified as the Edo social complex or foundational Black Americans are automatically assigned to work for at birth, involuntarily. It gives individuals within this corporation the ability to emulate a society. But it wasn't a corporation it created, nor is it one that it truly runs. The leaders of this corporation are assigned externally by the entity known as the United States of America. And its first product was the Negro. And that's important because when you examine the way artificial selection works, it's nothing more than another word for domestication. And the keys to a domesticated product is to intentionally intervene and direct the way in which that product grows. It's given a particular purpose and function, and it's selected for those characteristics that are in alignment with what the goal was. If the objective of this program was to create individuals that could function as hardware that produce a profit, that produce a product, and to do so indefinitely, it is safe to say that for the Edo social complex, that is the origin of our cultural inertia. And remember the axiom pinned here: a culture in motion stays in motion until a greater culture acts upon it. And even though you've got individuals that can break free from that cultural inertia, it's individuals doing so. When one examines individual particles, their trajectory and flow may run counter to the molecule that particle is associated with. Just because some particles within this iron molecule are behaving slightly different doesn't change the fact that it's still an iron particle. And in general, that molecule is going to behave in a way congruent and expectant of iron. So too does this apply to people in the culture. It is a big reason why I like this term, this Bantu proverb. Mimini ntukwa sababu kuna watu. I'm a person because there are people. If you can understand that no human being exists in isolation, And while they are free to make their own decision, they're only able to be a person because people exist. And your culture serves as a means by which you interface with this entire modality of reality within your environment. There are things that you are connected to whether you want to or not, influences that have affected your trajectory whether you realize it or not. And when it comes to bringing up that child, even though there are people who have succeeded in spite of not having certain characteristics introduced to them, if you want the greater number of people to find themselves in a favorable outcome, you need to intervene at the cultural level. And it starts with addressing the process of upbringing and providing purpose there. Because if you have individuals that are breaking free of the cultural inertia and they find that the way they've developed, having moved outside of the trajectory of the culture from which they were born, there's no way you're going to force them back into alignment with something that, from their perspective, appears dysfunctional. If we go back to the corporate model that I was using an illustration of, if you have an human resource issue, you need to negotiate with the workers. If the employees are not given the proper training for the job you're expecting them to perform, it is not the employee's fault that they can't perform the task for which you desire for them to perform if no modality of training for that has occurred. And one shouldn't be upset if other corporations are willing to hire them and teach them for the role for which they intend to perform. These things were supposed to be taught in that developmental stage. It's how a culture functions. Specifically, when we get to what is required to build institution. There's a slight segue. We'll prime that statement by simply saying that the very first institution, the one that was supposed to be responsible for bringing another human being into the world in the first place, is family. Without this initial institution, most culture has no context, and it is impossible for roles to be truly realized. And all you have is a random partnership where people are simply responding to stimuli. It is entropic by nature, ruled by chaos, and while the potential to succeed is there, far greater potential for failure is rampant unless you reduce the negative outcomes by creating the institution of family to eliminate as many negative outcomes as possible by creating as much stability within the home environment so that the culture can do its intended job, which is prepare you for the future. We'll go ahead and pause for a second and make a few acknowledgments of folks that have come in so far. Of what we've talked about, is there any questions about anything yet? I know this is serving as a bit of a review for something we've covered already, but thought I'd go ahead and ask now. All right, let's see. We've got okay, AB Media came through. If you're still here, Os. Got Shocks 112. Os, generational traumas. Yep. Art New Style. Glad you can make it, fam. Os. South Chic. Os. Rael. Os. Destro 0861. Os. Glad you can make it, fam. Lonzo Hall. Os. Let me know, Alonzo, if I sent somebody your way who was asking about insurance. Let me know if they if they sent a message out to you, and I'll see if I can contact them again. Grab second gear, Eddie. Os, what's good, family? See, we got 7. Cupidity says the school to prison pipeline doesn't start with the school, it starts with the womb. Sad and most unfortunately, fam. And we overrepresent that. I think we did the math the other day, and there's 33% of African American males got a record. Don't even make sense compared to the fact that we make up 6% of the damn population. And if you talk about adults that would qualify for that, that number is even smaller. There's absolutely no reason for that. Got D Wayne here. Os. Yeah, that kind of annoys me, man. It's like how people call Africa a country. Shout out to Sarah Palin. We got Ray Hanma from the Hanma Force. Os. Glad you can make it, fam. And then Trey Bentley says, Os. But this point here is rather important because I don't know how you can communicate and form institution without clear defined roles being presented to you that you train. And we need to understand that most of this is learned through observation and repetition. There are very few things that human beings acquire outside of reputation. Because once again, we're not dealing with an entity. Human nature does have some things that are pre-recorded, but the majority of it is a matter of bringing it out through repetition. This is taught while young because while you're younger, your neuroelasticity is much greater. Meaning, again, to use the analogy of the iron and heat, your ability to mold that metal has the greatest potential at younger ages when it's hotter. And that when it begins to settle, it's the techniques that have been given, the skills that have been cultivated during that time period, the skill of the blacksmith that can help mold that lump of iron, that lump of potential into something incredible. What you find that when you're working with vast amounts of people, it's possible for different groups of individuals to recognize latent talents early and begin molding them into very specific and useful tools for the aggregate. For example, when you look at what it takes for most cultures to create a doctor, it's not just a parental or an individual effort. Yes, that is a pathway that person has to walk with their own 2 feet, but they're encouraged and given the resources to make this happen by the environment under which they've been presented under. They find individuals with that talent early. And those that stand out, not so much because they have some sort of preconceived notion of, I was going to say superiority, but I think I'm looking back at the Edo social complex and the way we see things, because we overvalue talent, but only as it relates to the specific role that men have traditionally played within the Edo social complex, which isn't in a capacity that's generally intellectual, but physical. So we value talents that are more so related to physicality. Any indications of physical talent are championed. But the weird irony in that is that We don't value things that are the result of process. So individuals that may not show immediate physical talent are thrown out instead of cultivated. And there's this strange habit of individuals with talent not developing it, and it ends up being a net waste anyway. I will say that in general, this is seen as profoundly wasteful for most groups of people. And when an individual demonstrates any sort of mental acuity, potential, and capacity, instead of being rebuffed for it, they're immediately flagged for cultivation. They're immediately put in a position and given a process to follow so that their development sets them on a track towards that. Now, in the modern era, this is more so frowned upon because it's believed that the individual should have much more freedom than that they should be the ones to determine their ultimate destiny. And I think there can be some measure of balance with regards to that. However, what can't be denied is the inevitable outcome of groups of people who, irrespective of that, impose a cultural accountability on individuals with that talent. And the parents go out of their way to place them in a position to foster those skills. They ensure, by recruiting this assistance of the extended family, and thus the greater portion of the social network, to cultivate that child and place them in an environment where those skills can develop uninterrupted, which leaves them in a position to have a higher probability of succeeding. Thanks, Rehama. When this is realized at a greater level and it's made standard within the culture finds itself in position to produce a great number of these individuals. And so much so that it allows for that culture to more readily interface with this process of creating institutions. Because out of 1,000,000 of them, if they can get 100 individuals that are doctors, and they're there because of the work that the culture put in, there's a measure of investment, there's a measure of fealty. These 100 people will give back to the people that they serve. And they are, as a result, in these positions, not in spite of their culture, but because of it. When you don't have a system that's working in place to help produce that, you still may get those 100, but those 100 are not even going to be beholden to you under any way, shape, or form. Because they would have gotten there not because of you, but in spite of you. And so no institution can be formed. If you can take that and expand it out to the greater context of family, and we understand that it's that building block that creates a relationship from child, starting with the mother, to the cultivation from ages 0 to 7. And that molding process being executed by the father, and the extended community observing rites of passage starting from childhood, recognizing the start of puberty, and then finally recognizing their ascent to adulthood. When you can provide this modality of understanding and grounding, that individual is a product of the culture. And that building block within culture can go on to form institutions. Institutions are the required tool to interface with what is known as society within the modern environment, the social environment. Without the culture, you can't apply context to history. Because what you'll be learning are things and values that are inferred from other groups of people with experiences that likely differ from yours. And so you're incompatible with these individuals. Take, for instance, an individual trying to go to a psychologist. Someone who is from an environment in China is more than likely going to have a better understanding on how to address the psychological needs and dispositions of individuals that are also from that environment. You take someone who's outside of there, and typically speaking, a great deal of research is required to provide some assistance. It's no different than us. Folks like Amos Wilson and Dr. Francis Cress Welsing drove this point home over and over again. There are unique things, for example, within the Edo social complex that we have unique deficiencies and tendencies with regards to trying to match within this environment we call America. Things that other groups of people don't have to deal with in the same kind of context that we do. That it's then possible for us to go to these professionals and still not have our needs met because our disposition is completely misunderstood, and their predisposition oftentimes becomes harmful and nothing more than an incorrect projection. And little help is really realized in the sake of therapy. That's just there. When we look at other institutions, such as institutions that help establish justice, the reason why the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, for example, pushed within its 10-point program the desire to be judged by a jury of their peers, with emphasis on peers, to state that even when you're on jury duty, when you've got individuals that are not from the Black community, so-called, that aren't part of the Edo social complex, and they're looking at everyday situations we find ourselves when we have to interface with law enforcement, there's a lack of understanding. There's a lack of relatability. But if those officials that are being hired to serve as police officers, those individuals that are hired, that are placed there to be judges, are there not because of the culture, but in spite of the culture, the potential for you to be judged fairly with the required nuances of the values that you grew up with, informed by your culture, are absent. You're likely to be seen as simply the cultural other. And while there may be some general guidelines that are written on the books, those laws serve as guidelines. Nothing's written in stone. That's why there's so much flexibility. That's given there to provide nuance. On a small sidebar, this is a big challenge as it pertains to what we're going to call transhumanism and automation. Because we're looking at a reality potentially where a lot of these laws, a lot of these modalities of nuance are going to be left to some kind of algorithm that takes a look at the way things have been judged in the past, takes a look at potential surveys and what may occur. It'll run a formula and make a judgment and print it out just off the strength of that. And due to human beings tending to fall to the lowest common denominator or path of least resistance, we may find that as an actual form of executive power in the next 50, 60 years. That's the danger of these kinds of things when you off-source institution building and institutions in and of themselves to third-party entities, or entities that aren't born from the culture from which you manifested. They therefore require a kind of building block to get started. Initially, it starts with setting the context for relationships. Relationships set the context for family. Family sets the context for community, and community sets the context for the state. If you don't have culture animating that entire process, it is absolutely impossible to establish hierarchy. It's impossible to engage in relationship building. And if you do, it resorts more so to human nature rather than culture. You gain relationships predicated on personality, which are supposed to inform the environment, but they become very transactional. And thus, the relationships are more likely to simply just become mutually parasitic for one another and not symbolic. Because if you don't understand how to cooperate with one another and problem solve, because you're used to seeing and solving your problems exclusively on your own, and you see other individuals there as competitors, including the person you're working with, you can't establish trust. And without trust, there's no way you can cohere someone to invest in the well-being, the mutual well-being of each other, which is how humanity functions. It's a strange thing to have to actually talk about this. But when people want to speak about how to fix a community, if you don't have the currency of trust to spend to make that happen, you can't even form relationships, let alone families, let alone actual communities, nor can you participate in statehood. It is impossible. You are simply an individual who happens to be around someone, an individual that is related to someone, an individual that happens to live around someone, and an individual who happened to be born somewhere. These are not the same. The way you transfer and utilize that power is in groups, and it's culture that informs these things. And even if you have a culture, that culture still has to contend with its mirror power, which is civilization. Oftentimes, the problem that most people on planet Earth are dealing with is the fact that their civilization is beginning to outpace the speed at which their culture can adopt. If this is the case for other people who have cultures that are relatively intact, how much more so are you suffering when you have a culture that is so far backwards that it doesn't provide you the basic tools of trust and family building? It is virtually impossible to keep up in the social environment, in the physical environment. You may have a chance in the natural environment because we as human beings have had more time to evolve and adapt within the natural environment. But this physical environment that we now experience that has been influenced by this modern civilization, just starting with the first world alone, the introduction of telephones and electricity, it's something we're still catching up culturally. Prior to this, we had to deal with things such as the steam engine, maybe, letters being written, the mail system. Prior to that, written language. These things were hundreds of years, if not thousands of years in separation, giving human beings time to culturally adjust and come up with troubleshooting models to deal with it. Problems that would arise and manifest in the social programming, in the social environment, or the institutions, had generations to come up with a solution for it all. But in this environment, with the civilization, thanks to technology, moving at a rate that is profound, we're still having biological problems dealing with processed foods, which was created and expedited to address the Neo-Malthusians' fears of there not being enough food to feed the population boom. Ironically, now people are coming up with all of these diseases metabolically that are almost directly related to the creation of these foods, which our biology is rejecting. We haven't culturally addressed the issue of these foods being flooded within our environments, the physical environments that we live in. When we go to the grocery store, we're not eating the things our ancestors ate. We're eating something that came out of a plant somewhere that was been calibrated and processed to expedite the shipping process to maximize profit at the expense of our genetic ability to address the food, starting with the gut biome. That's how that plays out just on an individual level. But when we bloom out to the meta level, the way it affects the population, our demographic has non-communicatable diseases as the leading cause of death. Leading. That's more than violence, more than mishaps with technology. The very food we eat is one of the leading causes of death for our demographic. Yet and still, that is something very solvable by the culture. But since the culture hasn't been updated, what do? Follow the law of cultural inertia. A culture in motion stays in motion until a greater culture acts upon it. And so we eat the same way as our ancestors did in this updated civilization, where things have been done and tampered with that the culture has not caught up to and created a response for. So animated by this desire to cope and adapt to the plantation, we're even more predisposed to problems that manifest from that, such as high blood pressure, obesity rates, psychological predispositions that leave us torn. All of these things inheritable. You've got 9-year-olds that are obese at this point. You've got 9-year-olds that have insulin resistance, diabetes at 9. And for some, you've got people who are born with insulin resistance now. How is it that you're showing up with type 1, type 2 diabetes as an infant? This is the biology responding to the civilization because the culture hasn't interfered yet. These changes happened within the last 50 to 60 years. And we go back to the creation of institution. And again, how culture is the core of all of that. If we understand that can happen with just food, how much more so then for the sake of creating a balance with the formation of relationships? When we look at what the internet has done since 1982, when it was really mainstream with regards to accessibility, to the late 2000s when it became commercial, to now in 2020 where it's accessible everywhere with any device in the palm of your hand. It has taken not only your information and bombarded you with more info within the course of a week than some people experienced in a year just 100 years ago. It has made the social environment so much smaller. Understand that the whole medium under which you're hearing me right now would have been very unlikely to occur just 50 years ago, just 40 years ago. That's important. When you apply concepts such as social media, bringing it to where the entire world now has access to each other, and your potential of expanding that social networking culture also expands. It creates challenges that the culture has not created answers for. When we combine this with things such as the paradox of choice, and knowing that when you increase entropy like this and more possible outcomes are available, the presumption that the perfect option exists presents itself. And so in fear of losing out, people freeze themselves almost to an eternity. Go back 50 years and so many options weren't available and people were much more happier with the choices they had available. It's such a strange, interesting, counterintuitive phenomenon. It's one thing for this to occur to a couple people in isolation, but when it's expanded so much that it now becomes the standard, when a population of human beings have been conditioned to this kind of modality because corporations profit off of your thinking this way. Fear of losing out, fear of more options, fear being the common denominator. And thus, you buy and buy and buy, yet find yourself unsatisfied. These are things that the culture is supposed to address. But these things are changing and creating such a great disturbance by virtue of the civilization through technology that the social environment is being left far behind. It is disrupting the ecosystem. It is interrupting the process of homeostasis. In this state, I'm unaware of how an individual is supposed to change the trajectory of the aggregate when the entire environment has shifted. Because when the environment is shifted, it creates a reciprocal pace at which the culture is then responsive to. In other words, now you have children born having that technology in their hands. And when they're at that state of neuroplasticity where they were supposed to be learning from their parents, they're learning from a screen that doesn't provide facial expressions that they learn in mirror. The mirror neurons that are in their prefrontal lobes don't get that stimulation from an iPad. Learning tonality and engaging in language in such a way that they can feel the visceral connection of speaking to another human being, and thus the subtle subconscious changes and reflections of emotion are not present. So now these children grow up literally mechanical. From all the vast potential of human nature, only the most static characteristics are chosen. And so there's a lack of social plug-in available. These children grow up antisocial. And if they're male, they're expected to perform these traditional roles that they were never trained for. How in the world do they have the social adaptability then to properly communicate without coming off as strange, in particular to the women who have a proclivity to perceive these things? But even in the case of the women, who may also be socially awkward, if we stick to the older understanding that the moment she reaches puberty, that's all she needs for men to begin approaching her, does she really need to cultivate those social skills to gain the potential of procreation on a biological level? It's in these things that the culture, once again, was supposed to interfere and interject. But because the culture was calibrated for something totally different, it finds itself unable to outpace. And so even though one has culture, because they're not keeping up with the rate at which civilization is advancing, they're being left behind. And their institutions are the first locations that this weakness becomes apparent, followed by previous generations moving forward. I say all of that to say this. With this understood, there's absolutely no way a single person can be expected to change the tide of cultural inertia. These are things that need to be addressed on a systematic level, at the fundamental level where they all begin, which is the planning and the onset of life to being brought from the non-physical world to the physical one. And it starts with finding a proper portal with a proper summoner to draw that life forth. At first, it was a single summoner, but historically, human beings have, as a collective, as a people, as a community, set the rules by which they summon. And the women serve as those gateways and portals so that the community can summon that which it requires. It determines the role, and they form the institutions and reinforce those institutions as people pass on. Eldership initiation comes into place, and those elders teach the children during that critical state of neurological elasticity. And the process continues. having given up this modality for the sake of progress in the modern era. You'll notice that some cultures have gone back to that. The Jewish community comes to mind. A lot of the Indian community, the Eastern Indians, Desi Indian, that are classified as Asian, have figured this out. Many people who are in the upper echelons of society have figured this out. And it's why they maintain their traditions in the face of all of this civilizational upheaval. They maintain traditional institutions. And while everybody else lags behind, even though they may have cultures, the difference is their culture is designed in such a way as they are the ones that are gaining benefit from it. The culture is serving them. For everyone else, they're servants to their culture. And as such, their institutions lag in behind, and they're unable to maintain the hierarchy to keep up and stay competitive with those who don't have shackles. How much worse then are individuals who have not even engaged at the fundamental baseline requirement to form culture, which is the trust to form relationships and family? Without that, you have no chance. Not as a group. And it's only understandable that individuals who have succeeded not because of the community, but in spite of it, would go elsewhere where there's at least a role for them to perform, even if they're not around people who look like they do. I think I'll pause here. I'll do a couple acknowledgements and see who we have and possibly close up. Maybe I'll do a panel, we'll see. Definitely let me know if you have any questions on anything we've talked about so far, something else you want to cover before we start to close down. But I wanted to offer this update to the second sword form because I think it's relevant to a lot of the topics that have been circulating around the space as of late. And I want that to serve as a reminder on how institutions are built. Without culture, you can't even begin that process. And the purpose of culture is to serve as an interface from man to the environment. You're like hardware without software. And even if you have it, if it's not serving you, it's as good as not being there. See, we got Mansa Noir. I was just listening to a podcast about how susceptibility to trauma response can be transgenerational, meaning it's possible for epigenetic encoding to cause susceptibility to PTSD. Not only that, fam, they already proved that with folks who suffered from situations that went down during World War II. And they proved that not only do you pass that down, it can even skip generations. So you can inherit these things from grandparents. And these things can stay within your genetic memory for a very long time. But it's definitely the environment that triggers a lot of these things, which is the only good news. In other words, while you're born with the script that forms your body, you can choose your actors that perform that script. I only mention this because I've been reading about complex PTSD, which trauma that was not one instance, but endemic in a family or culture and how it affects our social responses. Yes, I talk about in the third verbal sword form, getting into the demon gate, and talking about coping mechanisms and how they inform a culture on how they respond to certain things that present themselves in life relative to how they solved it in the past. And how different cultures, when they've been in extended periods of stress and crises, how they address these problems in turn, and how those coping mechanisms get passed down. It's pretty interesting. Go on to say, I dare say that the Malthusian response was possibly due to a trauma of the 18th century Europe after plague, famine, and overpopulation. I do wonder if they were low key sort of right. What would have happened if they didn't have certain doctors go out and make these breakthroughs with altering food, particularly wheat? It's very possible that a lot of people may have experienced food shortages, but it's hard to say now. I like to call that situation the Y2K before Y2K. We got Asada Muhammad. Facts. It is void of nutrition. Indeed. Also, thanks for coming by today. Os. We also got a cash app here from Fred Holiday. He says, just another form of control. Appreciate you, fam. Os. We got Rael. He goes, if the mother and her choice in natural selection is not addressed, nothing matters. Because the social degradation we see in Black America comes through the psychology of the mother first. Indeed. That's why the gateways, the portals, sort of infer what's going to be brought forward in the first place. And even though she has the highest potential to bring about anything, she has the highest potential to bring about anything, which is a plus and a minus. That's why those gateways need to be chosen selectively and cared for appropriately. It's a matter of conservation, which runs very counter to the rhetoric that most women are offered these days, which is very unfortunate, especially when we get into roles. Goes on to state, effects of paternal high-fat diet and maternal rearing environment in the gut microbiome. Yeah, that's what I was speaking about earlier. Absolutely. I wish this was talked about more, but I think it probably isn't, because this would greatly reduce the impact of the pharmaceutical industry. However, I think we may see a return to this modality of treatment when we get into nanotechnology and the distribution of medicines to individual cells in the body. That's going to be interesting. We're definitely going to have a conversation on transhumanism again, and I'm going to double down on that when I go over my Hive Theory series and start putting a microscope under some of the things that are being talked about currently. I'll see if I can reach out to Dr. Nicole Ali and some of the other PhDs that are in the space that deal with tech and do a compare and contrast behind what their communities are talking about behind closed doors, and the conversation is being held in public about that, because I think that is going to serve as probably one of the greatest disrupting factors since the invention of fire. It's that profound. Ray says, motherfuckers is still eating shitterlings to this day. Man, who you telling, fam? I don't get it. I do, but I don't. Y'all live your life. Rael says, in natural selection, women choose who they allow to impregnate, therefore they bear the brunt of the responsibility. If women were into astronauts, we'd have more black males in space. Sounds a lot like Briffle's Law. Also, I wonder how much we've gotten into away from natural selection in this environment, and we've moved more so into group selection. I'm going to have that conversation too, because I think there should be something said about group selection, especially since we've been subject to artificial selection. And it's messed up because I think that is probably the model that's being rolled out in general. I don't think you can call what we're about to see with artificial wombs natural selection at all. That is definitely a form of group selection, which is a strange phenomenon that Darwin didn't deal with very well. He says the mother is the first scientist because through her nutritional value, she gives her family strength to work, i.e. your husband, and children to learn. Yeah, I mean, other cultures have figured that out very clearly, that there's a kind of power when you are the one that distributes the food. Also, I wanted to acknowledge Brotherly Love 215. Os, glad you can make it, fam. Eddie says, I guess unfinished technology is outpacing humans. Fam, the rate at which it's happening is so profound, and the speed that it's occurring is such that when you look at the nature of generations, I would make the argument that instead of 20-year increments in judging generations, we're down to 10, and it's going to shrink even faster, the faster, or the closer rather, we get to transhumanism rolling out. I mean, just information technology alone has had enough to erode groups of people who haven't intervened with their own cultures aggressively. It is the reason these children have high anxiety and cannot read their environment anymore. You know, again, shout out to the Mouse Utopia experiment. I mean, these side effects that we're seeing in the greater society are almost textbook. Textbook to the point of it's almost irresponsible to not acknowledge these things. Yep, some of these kids cannot even read basic facial cues like contempt or discomfort in others. And that's even going beyond the personality piece, where because of the kind of environment we find ourselves in, there's a strange sort of group selection taking place that favors narcissism and dark triad like personalities. And while that may be appealing to the lizard brain in some individuals, it's not conducive for society. But with the direction that we're headed towards, I think someone could make the argument that society is becoming more narcissistic almost intentionally. Appreciate you, Shango Zulu. Historical traumatology. Yogami. Mbote Mpangi. Also, we gotta have that conversation soon. I did get your email and I responded. So my new days off start this week. So we'll definitely be in touch. But yeah, what frustrates me about this is when you start talking about these things, people mischaracterize the conversation and claim that you're being a victim, etc. Or the double down on anecdotal collapse and talk about this exception and think that it's supposed to infer any meaningful information to the aggregate. It's very frustrating. Manson says Dutch winter hunger and World War II comes. Yep, that's exactly what I was referring to when I made the example earlier. Yeah, a lot of those kids were gaining obesity and all of that, and these were tied back to events that were happening to the grandparents. So these things definitely follow you. Nameless. Would Issei marriage and cult? Would you say marriage and culture is solely exclusive to the top 10% traditional? I mean, it's what it's shaping out, fam. It's like those people who are succeeding explosively have some modicum of culture that's being put in place that's maintained. And maybe there's a conversation to be had about class, but I really think that it's going to exacerbate the differences going into the future dramatically. And so we'll see institutions, which is what marriage is, like marriage be restricted to certain income brackets and really class designations. And it wouldn't be the first time that's happened in human history either, for the record. Gilgami says, greetings to all. Mbote. Mbote, fam. Great book on the transference of trauma regarding borderline personality disorder is, quote, I hate you, don't leave me. Women are more susceptible to things like borderline personality disorder than men, which means they're more than likely to pass that on to their kids, sadly. Shout out to that X chromosome and all of that potential we talked about earlier. No, he was talking to Noir. All right, cool. Appreciate that, family. Let's see. Noir goes on to state, I think the transhumanism movement will go two paths: genetic, biological enhancement route. or technological symbiosis with nanotech and neurotech. Ironically, that is the conversation to be had, the different pathways. And with that in particular, one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about culture today as well is because culture is going to be what has to be imposed and inferred to and deferred to when coming up with solutions with regards to this. Because it's going to be the culture that provides what meaning and what role these sciences and technologies should play. Otherwise, if you don't get involved now and aggressively get involved, these decisions are going to be made for people. And there are entirely too many things that are fundamentally challenging what we understand as human, intervening in domains that have largely been assumed the realm exclusive to human beings, such as your thoughts. I mean, what use is having a neocortex and a prefrontal cortex that comprises 10% of your decision making process when science technology can then find itself a free reign to manipulate the other 90% and know you better than you know yourself? To me, that's slavery on a different degree. And that's not even getting into what they may be able to do into the near future, such as observing in real time your brain patterns. Imagine having a conversation with somebody and you've got a sensor that's hooked up to some sort of chip in your brain. And it's something that other people who have that chip can recognize your brain waves and brain patterns and what you're thinking and your general surface thoughts and mood by just looking at you. There's a whole different way you now have to communicate with human beings after that. These are all things that can be weaponized against you if you're not careful. Things that nobody would even think to develop a culture around. But this is what we'll be dealing with in the future. And if you're just not used to using any of these things, if you just take your thoughts for granted, I mean, where's the line of sovereignty at with regards to that? At what point is free will being violated? At what point is your personal space being violated? Nobody's talking about these things in the numbers that they need to, because this is not something that is outside of anyone sitting around here's lifetime for the most part. These are things that we may see. These are things that if you have children now, they certainly will probably see. It's just a matter of how long it takes for a lot of these things to roll out. John Jones, glad you can make it. He says, do you think technology will absorb humanity? I think there's a constituency that sees humanity and human DNA as inherently flawed. And they believe that technology is a way that they can take supersedence over the process of evolution and introduce an idea that they call self-directed evolution. And through that self-directed evolution, they want to, quote, fix humanity, end quote, so to speak. And I'm of the camp that believes that this is irresponsible behavior, specifically because I don't think we've come to understand humans enough to make that kind of assessment that things need to be taken away. And the case that I defer to and refer to is what happened during the first industrial revolution and how the removal of many social institutions have caused traumatic damage to humanity, great despair, great harm in ways that aren't necessarily measured physically, but play out in a lot of these outcomes. And if doing something such as that causes all of these side effects, when you aggressively introduce some of these technologies that are being presented, such as some that's already being used, genetic editing, artificial wombs, the introduction of nanotechnology, 3D printing, artificial intelligence, algorithms that are performing institutional functions, automations that are performing low skill functions, the removal of work for some people and non-skilled labor. These things are going to create side effects that the culture has to respond. And it's not even done dealing with high fructose corn syrup. It's irresponsible in my perspective, but a lot of people at the top are very willing and eager to discard their humanity for the sake of progress. And he says that artificial womb is a game changer. You can pick and choose. Going back to group selection, like I was mentioning. Aquateki says, heaven forbid human generations last mimicking Moore's law. Looking at the fact that people can't come to a conclusion as to whether or not aging is a disease or if it's something natural that should be left to its own devices, I think you're going to see the case in point. The culture is going to have an answer and a solution for that. And if it doesn't, it's going to suffer a lot of consequences potentially for individuals that are formulating plans around that. It says at this point, it's better to educate your own children and develop your own curriculum. But the time they're 18, they could be designing their own companies. And that's the two-way door with regards to that. When you introduce this kind of entropy to a scenario, there are pathways that are now available that otherwise would never have been made. But those pathways could lead to a plethora of end results, many of which could be destructive, but some of which could be profoundly lucrative and beneficial. The key is to employ systems that are working in your favor, such as culture that is serving you, to interface with these new opportunities so that you maximize the potential for positive outcomes. I think that's the part that gets lost at the end of the day, because there's no alpha-ing your way through that. It's a textbook more like blueprint, according to design schema. You ain't wrong with that. No arguments. Or due to our spirituality that we will meet some symphony technology. I think that because of the way human beings are wired, I think we see a situation playing out potentially where the technology becomes the new spirituality for the majority of people. And instead of worshiping God or gods, they become demigods and worship themselves. That's why I made that statement about narcissism being selected for in the last 50 years and how those personalities will thrive in that kind of environment where social interaction and social consequence aren't required. And we're in a surveillance state type scenario where the mutual exploitation of human beings fits narcissistic ideology. Because with the narcissists, there are also the sub-narcissists that feed them. There's some people who feed off of being exploited by somebody. All it takes is a look at a lot of the popular, I'm going to say, private interests that many people have. You can very quickly see that. Yep, Rael just said it. In a nutshell. Yeah, you guys beat me to even saying it. You already know. When I learned of the mouse utopia's behavioral sink a decade ago, I had to rethink my approach to Pan-Africanism and race and black race renaissance. Fam, and it sucks because Gilgami, you already know, for the majority of the continent, the culture is too slow to react to even what's occurred to modern industrialism, let alone transhumanism. The culture needs an update badly. It's still stuck during pre-colonial eras. And I don't think many of the institutions that are being put in place are being done with an updated model. Instead, it's grafted a cultural interface from Europe, and it's creating all of these syntax errors that look a lot like African Americans, but the Edo social complex in general. And so many people have just given up on the idea of Pan-Africanism on both ends, both within the diaspora and folks that are living there on the continent. You probably see it with your own eyes from where you're at over there. It's a frustrating phenomenon. Nora says artificial wombs will cause humans to be born that no longer have a microbiome that will cause many humans to be allergic to living on Earth. For example, kids born by cesarean and more. Yeah, we talked about that earlier. What they're trying to work on now is addressing that, which was a big reason why they did the microbiome project. the Human Microbiome Project, a lot of these newer technologies that are coming out are going to be aimed at planting and seeding gut microbiomes that will permit human beings to live in more extreme conditions, because they're running into the same problems for people that live in space or have to deal with extreme environments for long periods of time. Ironically, though, they find our demographic quite useful in the long run, especially when it comes to dealing with extreme environments in space due to the increased radiation levels. Melanin does a good job in mitigating the damage of that, quite as it's kept. John Jones says, Brother Pennick spoke about the meet and merge of spirituality and technology. Yeah, I think that's worth having a conversation about. The liquor creep. Host, glad you can make it. He says, Brother, what are we black men do? We want better in this life. But what is our true purpose if traditionally it is regarded to be procreation? But I'm thinking that you know the truth about our true purpose. Please share our thoughts. That is a layered and loaded, I won't call it loaded. It is a layered statement. I'm going to put a pin on that. And I've talked about this before. But to give you the quick thumbnail version of it, I still think man's purpose here is to learn and grow. At its core, I think that's what we're here for. And it's unfortunate that we're not in a culture right now that views the majority of us as anything other than property and anything other than a liability, and sets us on a trajectory of scarcity to where the majority of us have to operate on anger and pride in order to get things done constructively. Because animated by those two energies, you can't have a solar-based communal modality. You can only have a void-based modality. For those that don't know, you can have a system that functions similar to other systems predicated on a black hole. But the kind of life you get that's animated by that kind of negative energy is very isolated to a very small percentage. Whereas those that are within a solar modality can share a much wider breadth and width of life and diversity with regards to the ability to experience altruism animated by the spirit of love. I guess I'll be getting into my subjective opinion on that, but I want to save that for another video because it's getting much more into a spiritual conversation, which it seems as though there's a desire for that within the space. And if I can serve as a conduit for that, I have absolutely no issues doing so. And I mean that in a spiritual sense and not a dogmatic or religious sense. I aggressively separate the two while respecting people's religious proclivities. I think these are very different things. And I think these are some things that people need to question with regards to the fundamental concept of human being challenged with these technologies that are on the way, that are being developed. See, he asks, do you watch Black Mirror? No, but everyone keeps recommending it for me. I guess I'll take that as a sign and I'll start taking a look at that. Says that also makes me think about how Napoleon Hill mentioned broadcasting, casting, and superimposing thoughts on other individuals. Yeah, I mean, when you have things like anchoring bias and all of that, you know, they really set the tone and context to how human beings interpret the world around them. But again, you can't alpha your way through culture contrary to popular belief. John Joe says, I've been in the building every time you've been in the room with Gigi and Admiral Smoke. Intelligence in this podcast of space is intelligence in this pocket of space, gotcha, is very important. The law of critical mass is real. Quality versus quantity. Fam, I preach that all day long. I call it the bootstrap theory. Folks think that 99% equals 1% equals 50-50. It's so ridiculous. Just because something is possible doesn't mean it's probable. If you want to get results for the aggregate, you need to employ systems to change that probability. But again, this is how people have become socialized lately when they exploit profit. If the DNA is flawed, who or what is the blueprint? And I would make the argument that the blueprint is in the hands of the culture, i.e. the community. There's a concept called the superorganism, and even our individual bodies emulates this idea. We have just as many chromosomes as an earthworm. And our bodies genetically only account for 10% of our body. 90% of our body is nothing more than water and other bacteria that's influenced by our genetic bacteria that is created from our DNA. We are, in other words, an aggregate of systems that culminate to who we are as human beings. It's absolutely humbling when you think about it all. And in that same way, that's how we comprise humanity as individuals. That's why we have a shared responsibility for our collective experience. And even when we get onto a psychological level with the collective unconscious, there are ways at which we interface at levels that our prefrontal cortex just doesn't recognize, but it's part of that 90% that makes up the rest of our intellectual processes. There's a pattern here with this 90-10. John Jones says we've become very irresponsible people. I mean, when your field of awareness is limited to scarcity and profit, I don't know what else people expect in the collective, especially with this stay in your lane culture that's superimposed on everyone. This hustle culture of trying to squeeze water out of rocks. This idea that we don't have any kind of connection with the next person and aren't creating all of these karmic bonds of suffering with one another. But just because one of us makes it, that, everybody else should have been able to. It's right and wrong. Everything has consequences to that at the end of the day. Eventually, that cycle comes to find you, whether it be in this expression or another one later on down the line. But it's why, again, I made mention of that narcissistic personality being selected for. So the more indifferent human beings become, the better this software works. Oh, he was talking about. Tro Bentley. Yeah, man. Shout out to you programmers. I don't know how you do it. I don't have the patience. Respect to you guys. Says, damn, we're still reacting to colonialism when the world is an advanced technology paradigm, fam. Just talk to some people on the continent right now. They'll let you know. They'll tell you. They'll tell you. It's a frustrating thing. Yeah, we spoke on that earlier also. They're treating a lot of psychological impurities with just implanting feces from a healthy sample to another. Again, it's the pharmaceutical industry that's not happy about that, because then they can't sell stuff the way they used to. Gilgami says you're correct. There's a need to go deep into tradition to re-innovate the collective paradigm, the cultural environment. Otherwise, we're going to fall off the cliff as well. I mean, it's a sad thing because there's a lot of gems that are within that cultural seed all throughout the continent. I think the idea of Pan-Africanism, it has the right idea, but even Garvey continued to emphasize that science was the key, and that's the one area that we in aggregate have ignored, because science was the key motivator with technology. And when you can update your culture in parity to the advances of the technology and civilization, the amount of command that you can emphasize within your institutions is magnified profoundly. And that's actually how everyone else has stayed a step ahead of us, if not 2 or 3. You gave a link. Let me see. Okay, yeah. He's a mod, I was going to say. We got Lee Ali. I don't think I saw you earlier, but welcome, fam. Os. It says Altered Carbon deals with it as well. I think it's a good book to, or movie if you see the series. I guess it was Netflix or Hulu it came on. I mean, it introduces the idea to a lot of the stratification that's there, but these folks like giving you an image to look at. Any sort of dystopian future, cyberpunk kind of content really digs into some of this, but there's other good IPs like Foundation, for example. See, we've got John Jones. I'm a diffusionist. Okay. Yeah, we're definitely going to have a transhuman and fourth industrial conversation and parody it off with culture when we take a look at hive theory and some of what's really on the way. Social quantum singularity. I mean, yeah. I mean, in that low-key Elliott wave principle in a nutshell, damn near. I mean, if you just introduce all these other technological modalities and get people even more so on the same page and have them reinforce it under this fear paradigm, Chinese style of worrying about your social score, people don't think about this stuff, fam. It says a good anime to watch is Exception. It deals with the whole ethics problem with artificial womb. So he says Altered Carbon is good. It indeed is good, fam. The Liquor Creep says, thank you for your thought. I await your conversation on this topic. That has me at the age of 46 with no children as well, gainfully employed. I do not feel the need. I do not feel fulfilled in this life I occupy. That situation is more common than it should be. In Japan right now, 44% are involuntarily celibate, both the men and the women. Less than a 50% marriage rate. Within the next 5 to 10 years, they're going to be at a place to where there's going to be more people retiring than the people working, meaning the healthcare system that upholds that won't be able to sustain the people who are alone. Just to give you a difference in what went down. And I'll do a video on this. I keep talking about it. Just before World War II, they had a 97% marriage rate. 97%. They're down below 50% at this point. It's crazy. I mean, this is a first industrial situation. And again, we saw a lot of this play out during, the Mouse Utopia experiments, but people like discounting that stuff. It's unfortunate. It says culture imprints on the DNA. Well, epigenetics, I'm going to have to revisit that as well because, there's some people, we had to talk about it at first because people thought we were talking about eugenics when we said epigenetics. But we're going to see eugenics play out when we have genetic engineering allowing people to change things within your phenotype. So even though individuals genetically may not be reproducing who are of European descent, you can imagine the kind of physical phenotypes that people are going to be electing for once they can create a baby. And I mean that in the RPG, video game, MMO kind of sense. The gravitational well of the social quantum singularity crushes those who try resisting, i.e., those seeking traditional dynamics as we see currently. That's the one advantage of having cultural inertia. If you can stay on the outskirts of that black hole, you can stay in orbit almost indefinitely. But you've got to be set on track to maintain that so you don't get pulled in. Ironically, it kind of reminds me of SYSBM and Passport Bros, but like I said before earlier, immigration with an E, something that human beings have been doing since time immemorial. Shout out to the Bantu migration. That is a deeper conversation I'll hold for another time when we really get into the mechanics of DNA. And I really want to dig again into that 90-20 principle, or 90-10 principle, rather. Founder of the microbiome sequencing company called Viome said, quote, what if we are a transport and what if we are a transport slash environment custom built by microbes together and control slash drive us via chemical messaging? I mean, that's exactly what's happening. But when you expand that out to what I'm talking about with hive theory, that's precisely what social media does low key via the internet, which is funny to think about. This is why blacks need to learn to separate instead of trying to save that which is set for self-destruction. Maybe Ryo missed what I said in the very beginning about that whole corporate model, but I concur. What they could do is just improve HR and they'd probably get better results, but can't ask for customer service here, apparently. Older stepdaughter is going to have it rough, sadly. Intelligent and talented, but poorly adjusted. Yeah, that's the name of the game. And thanks to Briffel's law, Lot would rather be alone than be with anyone else. And because of what we know about the proclivity for females to be able to have a propensity to be with other females, I think we're going to see a dramatic increase in the lesbian population if it's not already happening. And that's going to create some, I'm going to say, political backlash, because I don't think that L in LGBTQ works very friendly with the other aspects of that, especially if there's any Y chromosome involved whatsoever, as we're probably seeing already in certain circles. My presence was brief, but I have to leave nonetheless. See you another time and place. Peace. Us. Take care, fam. I'm going to need to take a look at that series. I haven't seen it yet. Not the new one that came out. Yep, I concur. Very much so concur. I will peep that video a bit later. I'll go ahead and save it now. Thanks for sharing that. Let's see. Oh, that's Ask Shogo. Yeah, he's got a lot of good videos on Japanese culture, things that are happening currently, Budo, etc. Says you need to consolidate all the cultural physics, laws, social thermodynamics. I plan to. I'm going to revisit these verbal martial art forms and, go a little bit more into depth of these principles, because again, I designed them in such a way that they speak about principles that we use in regular language out in the space and in our everyday lives. And I think they really help contextualize what's happening and maybe what's not happening, because we get these very binary views on things that don't accurately match with the reality we see oftentimes, and it's frustrating. Or it says, look up a Russian series called Two Hills, Women Live in a Civilized Society and Men, What's Left? After war, they're pushed out into the wilderness of the old world. It is ironic how Russia may find itself in that position pretty soon. I won't be hyperbolic, but they're in martial law right now. They got a lot of goofy potential that could happen. So things just got very real over there pretty recently. Mm. They live as primitive people, yeah. Got Sand Dog. Os. Glad you can make it, fam. I'm about to go ahead and close this down. We're at the 2-hour mark. I definitely appreciate you guys coming through, chopping it up. For those that are on the replay, definitely appreciate your listen. If you get the opportunity, definitely leave a comment down in the description or down below. If you've got any questions, you're free to email me. All of my contact information is in the description. And with that, we'll go ahead and close out. To the dojo. Os. To those of you in the chat. Os. This is the nameless protagonist. Thanks for joining me. Have a great day.